Afternoon. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Kiddushin Daf Samach Vav, and we are starting about 8 or 9 lines from the bottom of Samach here in the base at the words Amar Abaye. Today we're going to be learning at length the whole entire day, all the way until the Mishnah toward the bottom on Samach Vav in the base about the dinim of Eid Echad. The Gemara says in the name of Abaye, Amar Abaye, Amar lo Eid Echad achal chelev. Let's say I walk over to you and I say, you just ate the fats of an animal that are asr. And the Gemara says, "B'hala shosei," and you take the punch. You don't respond at all. So the din is ne'eman. The din is that it seems to be that I'm correct and you're guilty, and therefore the Mishnah would align with this. V'tana tuna, we have a brisa that says as follows: Amar lo eid echad achlas chelev. You seems to be that you've eaten chelev. V'hala amar lo achalti. In a slightly variant case in the Mishnah, it says that you argued against me and said, no, I didn't eat chelev at all. In such a case, pater, and the Gemara infers from there, taima de amar lo ha'ishtik mehemen. So in case number one, it seems very clear that if I walk over to you and accuse you of something, which would then generate the need for a korban, eating chelev being the example, if you push back on me, then I'm not believed. If you are shosek, then it's shtika kehoda adamya. Your silence is the evidence that you're guilty. And the Gemara presents another case that's very similar. We'll see 3 very similar cases, and then we'll have to ask why we need all 3. And 5 lines from the bottom, the Gemara says another case. V'amar Abaye, Amar lo eid echad nitmu taharosecha. I say, hey, I'm watching you do some work. The bread that you've been working with for taros, they've all become tameh. And v'hala shosek, and you're silent. The halacha is that I'm neman to make such a claim against you. The Tanatuna, here too, we have a brisa from which we can make an inference that this din is true. Eid echad omer nitmu, if I say about you that all of your taros have become tameh, v'hala amar lo nitmu, if you push back against me and say, no, they were not tameh, so then the halacha is that you're a pater, and that you've done nothing wrong, and you're allowed to push back on me. Totally fine. But the inference from here is as follows. Taima de amar lo. The reason why is because you pushed back against me. But ha'ishtik, but if you would have said nothing, then the halacha is that mehemen, that my claim against you would have been believed. 2 very similar halachos, chelev and taros. Case number 3, also very similar. Amar Abaye, amar lo eid echad shorcha nirva. Let's say that I say about you that you're sure that your animal was nirva, that there was an act of sodomy that was done to that animal. And Rashi says at the top of the page, and we are also on the top of the page on Samach Vav Amud Aleph, Rashi says, "V'asur lehakrava," that it's now going to be asur for a korban. So the Gemara continues, if I say that about your animal, and v'hala shosek, but you say nothing, the halacha is ne'aman, that I'm trusted to make that comment. And here too, the Tanatuna, we have a brisa that by inference would be able to infer such a thing. This brisa is not quite as easy as the previous 2. The Gemara says, second line on Samach Vav Amud Aleph, v'shenevda bo avera, v'shehemis al pi eid echad. If an animal was used for an avera, or if it was and it killed based on the testimony of one, o al pi bailim, or if it was based on the bailim themselves. We'll have to see what this phrase means. The Gemara says ne'eman. The Gemara says that he's trusted. And the Gemara now analyzes this brisa of the Tanatuna in order to prove the case of shorcha nirva. The Gemara says, wait 1 second. Hi al pi eid echad heichidami. What does it mean al pi eid echad? Either kamodu bailim, hainu al pi habailim. We already have the language al pi habailim. So when you say both the language of al pi eid echad in the brisa and the language of al pi habailim, why is it that we have both of those languages? And the Gemara responds, elalav, it must be dishasik, that we see over here that the reason why we trust, we assume that when I make a claim of shorcha nirva and you are silent, we assume that when it says the kamodu bailim, we're talking about the shasik where they are silent. So therefore, we have 3 cases in a row. We have the case number 1 is about chelev, we have case number 2 is about taros, and case number 3 is about shorcha nirva. And the Gemara says 5 lines down on Samach Vav Amud Aleph, v'tzricha. We actually need all 3 of these cases because we would have made a mistake if we didn't have all 3 of these cases. Says the Gemara as follows. If I only had the first case, the case about me making a claim about you, that you've eaten chelev, therefore, there in that case, if in fact you didn't do that avera, you for sure would have said something because chulin ba'azara lo hava maisi. In that case, you would have been very careful to be honest about your own errors. Your silence has to be that you're guilty, because otherwise you would never bring a korban that you now need to bring if you violated the Isra b'achilas chelev. If you bring a korban when you're not allowed to, that is bringing chulin la'azara. That's an itzur d'oraisa, and you're not allowed to do that. So therefore, we understand that the silence over there, we understand why you're ne'eman with that silence in case number one. Aval, in regards to the second case, nitzmahu tahorosecha, meimar amrinan, hai deshasik desavar, azi levi metumaso. Okay, it's tame. No, big deal. The taros are tame. I'll save them for when I'm tame. If a man becomes a zav, or if a woman becomes a nido or a zava, whatever the tuma status is. Okay, I'll save that food for another time. It's not the same gravity as the first case, and therefore we need to have case number two. Case number one, we were concerned about chulin bazar, so for sure he has to make sure his silence is for sure deafening. But in regards to the second case, not necessarily. So we needed both cases to be presented in order to make sure that we knew that both cases were ne'eman, that if I make one of these two claims against you, that you're still going to be considered guilty. And if you had only the second case of the taros, mishum de kamafsi levi me taraso, granted you're losing out on them, you can't eat them when you are tahor, if in fact they are tameh. Aval, says the Gemara, shoro nirba, but in regards to the case of the animal, where there was where the animal was nearby, where it was sodomized, Neymar Amar kol hashvarim lav legabe mizbeach kaimim. Big deal. Okay, so then I won't bring that animal as behakrava, and therefore tzricha, we need all three of these cases. Lamaisa, all three of these cases, the case first of Chelev, the second case of being Matame Taros, and the third case is the case of Shorcha Nirva. In all of these cases, if I make a claim against you and you are Shosek, the halacha is that my claim is correct. And we brought all three cases because all three cases are not perfectly comparable. Let's continue with our discussions about how far we trust in Eid Echad. The Gemara says about 12 lines down, if a woman was mizana and the witness was only one witness, and when the husband heard about this, he was shosek, he was silent. So if this formula happens, mahu, what is the din? The husband didn't see the woman do anything. An aide saw the woman do something, and the aide told the husband, and the husband was shosek. Amar Abaye ne'eman. That means that we believe the claim of the Eid Echad. And Rava Amar Eno ne'eman. And Rava shares the most classical reason, though we'll see new understandings of it shortly. Why is he Eno ne'eman? Because have a davar shebe erba, vein davar shebe erba pachos mishnayim. We can't say that she was mizana based on one aid because it's davar shebe erba. And whenever we're dealing with varm shebe erba, ein davar shebe erba pachos mishnayim. Now Abaye is going to give a couple of lengthy attempts as to how he knows that he's right, that at times we do trust even one person in regards to Edus. The Gemara says a third of the way down, Amar Abaye, Mino Aminola. How do I know, my Shita, that one aid can bring about a scenario where we then assume that the woman was Mizana? The Gemara says there was a story. De'ahu Samya, there was a blind man. Dehava Mesader Masnaisa, Kami de Marshmuel. He was the one who had memorized all of the Mishnayos, and he did so for the sake of Mar Shmuel. Maybe he did it for himself as well, but he was the one who would present Mishnayos Balpeh. Yom Echad, one day, Nagale, the blind person, was late to the base medrash, v'lo hava ka'asi, and they didn't see him coming down the street. So Shadar Shlicha Abbasrei, Mar Shmuel sent someone to go knock on this guy's dorm room, or whatever the case may be, go to his house, just to make sure everything was okay, and to bring him to the base medrash. The Azil Shliach, Bechad Orcha, Asaihu Bechada. When the shliach was, he took path A to get to the person's house. While that happened, the guy had taken the samya, the blind person, took path B to get to the base medrash. So they just walked in different directions. And then the Gemara says, Ki asa shliach. When the shliach came back, he had apparently seen that the blind man's wife was mizana. Amar ishto zinsa. He said, unfortunately, the person who's misader mishnayis, the blind person, that ishto zinsa, that his wife was dishonest and she was with another man. So this man, brokenhearted, Athilakami de Marshmuel, he went to his Rebbe and said, Rebbe, what am I supposed to do? So we have an emunus issue because there's only one aid. And the Gemara says it like this. Amarle, Marshmuel says to the man whose wife potentially cheated on him, if this person is believable to you, Zil Afka, then yes, you need to remove her from your life. Namely, we assume that she's guilty. V'ilo, if he's not ne'eman to you, then lo tafik, then you don't have to remove her from your life. My love, doesn't this shita mean, doesn't this response of Mar Shmuel mean that that if we believe in him in that he is not a thief, in other words, he's a valid witness. If in fact he's a valid witness, then we trust him, and if not, not. Which implies, like Abaye wanted to say, and this is a brisa to support him. This then implies, it's actually not a brisa, but it is a story. A brisa would have been introduced with Tana Rabbanan, Tanya, Tnan, Tanatuna, a whole bunch of different possibilities, but over here there's none of that. It's actually a story in the early times of the Amoraim. So the question comes from Mar Shmuel, and Mar Shmuel was the one who said, well, it must be that if this guy is a real aid, then in fact your wife is assumed to have been Mizanam. So Abaye has some footing to stand on. And to this, the Gemara responds as follows. We're halfway down, just about halfway down on Samach Vav Maral. The Rava, no. It says no. Zil afka. A bit of a very unique answer is that if you trust this one person as though he's two, then yes, you have to remove your wife. The ilo lo tafka. But if you don't trust him like two, so then you don't have to remove her. This is again very, very, very interesting language, because who cares if he's one person that's considered two or one person that's considered one? That's what the Gemara seems to say. So therefore, Rava is not rejected based on the comments of Mar Shmuel, even though the comments of Mar Shmuel do seem to align like the Shita of Abaye, but Rava is able to explain away. Let's try another raya for the Shita of Abaye. The Gemara says, "V'amar Abaye mino aminallah." How do I know that one aid should be trusted in this case of a man claiming that Ishto Zinsa? The Gemara says, the Brisa writes as follows. There's a story with Yanai Hamelech, the king. He went to a particular location in the desert, and he captured 60 communities. On his way back, he was an extremely happy person after his conquest. And he called a party, he invited all of the Chachamim to come celebrate the conquest. Amar lahem, he said to them, Avosenu hayu ochlin meluchim bizman shahayu asukin bevinyan Beis HaMikdash. Back in the day, when the Jews were building the Beis HaMikdash, they used to eat meluchim. So what's meluchim? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi is a quarter of the way down on the page. Dibur hamaschel meluchim yurakos heim v'shamein kekuli b'lashon arami kegon hakotfin maluach alei siach. It's some type of tasty vegetable. Didn't know those things existed. So this is something that they used to eat bisman shebeis hamikdash hayakayim. So Yanai Hamelech wanted to do something that was reminiscent of the past, and he said, "Af anu ne'echal meluchim zecher la'avotzenu." We should do the same thing. V'ha'elu meluchim al shulchano shel zav achlu. And he got this vegetable that everybody used to eat back in the day, and they ate them as a commemorative form of what had happened in the past when the Yidden were building the Beis HaMikdash, and they ate meluchim. There was a guy there. Ish Leitz, this man was a Leitz, he was a scorner. Levra, he had a bad heart. Uvliyal, he was just an awful person. Elazar ben Po'ira Shemo, this was his name. Vayomer Elazar ben Po'ira, Liyanai Hamelech, and he said to Yanai Hamelech as follows: Yanai Hamelech, libam shel prushim alecha. The hearts of the prushim, the hearts of the chachamim are against you. So Yanai Hamelech says back to Elazar ben Po'ira, what would you like me to do? So Elazar ben Po'ira said, Hakeim lahem b'tzitz shebeneinacha. Go put on the tzitz, the garment that the Kohen Gadol would wear on his forehead. Go get it and put it on. And he happened to have been a Kohen Yanai, or was he? We'll have to see what the story in the Gemara, what the Gemara says about that. And he says, put it on, and then Hakim lahem. So then Hakim lahem b'tzitz shebeneinacha. If you put it on, and everybody stood up because that's the din by the tzitz that they had to stand up. There was an old man there, but Yehuda ben Gedidya Shemo, and this man's name was Yehuda ben Gedidya. Yehuda ben Gedidya Yanai Hamelech, and he complained to Yanai, and he said, Yanai Hamelech, Rav loch keser malchus. Isn't it enough that you're already the king and you're wearing a crown? Anach keser kahuna lezaro shalom. Just stay in your lane. Leave the tzitz for the children of Aaron a Kohen. In other words, there was an assumption up until now that Yanai Hamelech was a Kohen, and because that's true, he should have been able to wear the tzitz. But Yehuda ben Gedidya said, "You're not a Kohen." Because there was a rumor about Yanai Hamelech that his mother was nishbeis, that she was held as a captive, and because she was held as a captive, she is therefore considered to have been violated, and therefore she's not supposed to marry a Kohen. And the child of that union was Yanai. which means that he's a chalal, which means that he should not be wearing the tzitz. Now, they started to do some research on whether or not this was actually true, and it turned out that there wasn't enough information to assume that Yanai wasn't a Kohen. And he separated himself from the Chachamim in anger. But Elazar ben Po'ira wasn't done poking the bear. The Gemara says 15 lines, 20 lines from the bottom. But Yomer Elazar ben Po'ira Yanai Melech. Come on, Yanai Melech. If had you been a head Yotze B'Yisrael, Kachudino, you just want to be angry at them and ask them to leave. That's considered sufficient. You're both a king and you're a Kohen Gadol, and you're giving them this little flip of the wrist that just everybody get out, and that's okay. No big consequence to them. So Yanai Amelech says back to Elazar ben Po'ira, what would you like me to do? So he responded, if you're going to listen to me, then Romsem, Rashi, Romsem, 3/4 of the way down, maybe 2/3 of the way down, Hargame, you should kill them. So Yanai Amelech was a good guy at the time, and he said, wait 1 second, the Torah matahela, what's going to be with the Torah? If I kill all the Chachamim, who's going to be able to teach Torah? So Elazar ben Po'ira responded, don't worry, the Torah is sitting up in the corner. It's over there in the Aron Kodesh. And there will be other people who will learn. We'll be able to replace these guys. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak miyad. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, when he heard this story, because Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak lived much later, he said miyad nizrika bo apikorsis. And in fact, in the earlier versions of the Gemara, nizrika bo minus, it's considered to be heresy. What is the heresy that had entered into his head? To have a Leila Meimar, what Yanai Amelech should have said back to Elazar ben Po'ira is Teinach Torah shebichsav. I could understand. People can go pick up a scroll and learn Breshis Bar Elokim all the way to the end of Sefer Torah. They can figure that out. However, Torah Shabal Peh, what's going to be with the Torah Shabal Peh? So first of all, Yanai Melech should have argued that because he was a smart guy. He knew what he was talking about. And second of all, that also means that it's considered heretical to only believe in the Torah Shebichsav and not the Torah Shebal Peh. And there was a gentle implication over here that Yanai either forgot. That's why it was Nichnas Bo, Nizruka Bo Apikorsis, because that's ridiculous. The Torah on its own in a vacuum is it's cryptic. There's no way to understand it. We spend every day in Shas trying to figure out what one pasuk means, what one letter means. We're going to see by the end of the day today what 1/2 of one letter means. We're constantly trying to figure out what the Torah means. We work very hard to do that. It's not a simple task. It is apikorsis to say that you only believe in the Torah Shebichsav. So how could Yanai Amelech ignore the Metzias? How could he ignore the fact that the Torah Shebal Peh needs to be explained as well? Nevertheless, Yanai did not say anything back like that to Elazar ben Po'ira. Miyad, Totzetz Hara al Yedei Elazar ben Po'ira, and all of these terrible things happened because of Elazar ben Po'ira. Vayahargu kol chachmei Yisrael, and Nebuch, Yanai HaMelech killed all of the wise people of the Jewish people. Vaya'olim mishtomim, and the world was silent, dormant. There was no real Torah growth at that time. Ad sheba Shimon ben Shetach v'hichzer es haTorah liyoshna. Shimon ben Shetach, his sister, was the one who was married to Yanai, so he was spared in all of the murders. That's what Rashi says. Rashi says 15 lines from the bottom, Shimon ben Shetach, Achi Ishto Haya. He was the brother of the wife of Yanai. Okay, so then, Ad Sheba Shimon ben Shetach v'hichzer es haTorah liyoshna. End of the story. This is a very long argument for Abaye to put up with. Abaye is trying to show us, remember where we started. Abaye is trying to show us that one aid is able to determine status in regards to Znus. Normally we say, in Davar Erba Pachos Mishnayim. So now the Gemara analyzes what we just learned. We're 4 lines from the bottom. Heichidami. Ilema debei trei amre ishtaboy, ubei trei amre lo ishtaboy. If when we were talking about the mother of Yanai, and 2 witnesses said she was held captive, in which case she's not allowed to marry a Kohen, and therefore Yanai HaMelech would be a Chalal. Or there were 2 witnesses against those 2 witnesses that said, no, that we know that the mother was not Nishtaboy, she wasn't held captive, and therefore the marriage was acceptable, and therefore he's considered a regular Kohen Yanai. So then, my chazis the samchesani smochani. That's not a raya. That's just a machlokas. That's just a something we don't know how to paskin in that case. That can't be what's going on over here. Perhaps it must have been be'ed echad, that there was one aide who testified that his mother that Yanai's mother was held captive, and Vitaima to Kamak Shile Betray. And the reason why the Eid Echad lost, remember we said in the conclusion it was V'yevuka Shadavar V'lo Nimtza. So if you have one aid saying that yes, she was held captive, and then you have two aidim saying no, she was not held captive, so the two knock out the one, and therefore we assume that Yanai was a proper Kohen. But what we infer from here is halav hachi mehemen, is that without the betray, without the two people competing against the one, we would have to assume that the one would then be trusted. We therefore see, granted at great length, we therefore see Abaye has a proof that one aid is trusted in regards to znus, because one aid was able to say that Yanai's mother was considered to be nishbes. Granted, in this case, we didn't believe that one aid because there were two aidim who opposed that. That was via V'yavuka Shadavar V'lo Nimtza. But Lamaisa, had those other two aidim not been there, we would have taka trusted the one aid. So the Gemara says, Rava, what would he say? Rava, because remember, Rabbi and Rava are arguing about the case of Znus. Rava says you need two aidim. Abai says you need one. Says the Gemara, Rava Amar, no, trey. Really, we're talking about a case of 2 and 2. In another context, not here on the Meforshim, over here on the side, it says this is quoting a Gemara in Yevamos, one that we're not going to refer to now in detail, but just like over there in Yevamos, there was a case scenario where there were two Eidim against two Eidim, and one of them turned out to be Eidei Hazama. So maybe the same thing is true over here. Really, it is Trey. And in regards to Yanai's mother, maybe two witnesses said, two witnesses said she was taken as captive, and two witnesses say she wasn't. And then the Eidim who said she was taken as captive became Eidei Hazama. There, Imanu Hayistem. How could you tell me that you were where Yanai's mother? You were with me in Honolulu. There's no shaykhs to your argument at all. They became goners, and then the only shita that was left was two Eidim who said she was not nishbes, and therefore Yanai is a perfectly fine kohen. Another way that Rava could wriggle out of this proof is Kidder Rabbi Yitzchak. The Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Shifcha hichnis tachteha, that they actually swapped out his wife with a Shifcha, and Yanai was a daughter of that Shifcha and not of who we think his mother was, and therefore perhaps the Eidim over there were not even relevant. We weren't even talking about that case at all. Maybe what they found out had nothing to do with Eidos. Yes, maybe the mother was nishbase, maybe she wasn't nishbase, but the Maisa doesn't matter because that woman wasn't his mother. Difficult thing to say because as Rashi says at the bottom of the page, Shifcha yichnisu tachteh yichnisu lahem Shifcha v'chesvurim shehi zos v'ganvuha mehem la'achar shenishbeis ad shelo nisyachta below edim hilkach ein kan hakchoshas edim. Difficult, but nevertheless, that's what the Gemara says. So Abaye has tried twice to prove his shita. Let's now move over to the shita of Rava. How do we know that we need two edim in regards to Dover Sheva Erva? Last two words on Samach Vav Aleph. Amar Rava, Samach Vav Beis. Mina Aminala. From where do I know that there is such an idea that you need two Eidim for Davar Sheva Erba? Says the Gemara, Ditnan. The Mishnah writes as follows. This is a Tosefta in Maseches Miklos. Amar Reb Shimon. Maisa b'Megura Shel Diskim. There was a story about a pool from the city of Diskim. It was a mikvah. B'Yavne. It was the word Diskim is a bit of a discussion over here. It could be a name of a person. It could be the name of a place. And it was physically within Yavne. So it might have been a neighborhood in Yavne or a person who lived there. Our assumption was at the time that it was exactly 40 sa. And then someone measured and they found that it was actually a little bit less than 40 sa. So how do we view all of the things that went into that mikvah, all of the tevilos that were prior to this moment? Do we look back and say, well, if it's 39.5 sa now, so everything beforehand is aser, tameh? Or no, do we say that, no, we only start our concerns now, but everything beforehand is fine? This is a machlokes tanoim. Kol taros shena'aseh al gaba, everything that was used in that mikvah, from prior to that moment. Of course, you can't go in the mikvah now because we know it's 39.5. But before checking, we assumed it was 40. Rabbi Tarfon the tire and Rabbi Kivu the tam. So machlokas about everything that goes prior. This is reminiscent of the Mishnah in the beginning of Maseches Nida, when a woman is poreses Nida when she's working on taros. How far back do we have to be concerned that she was taka Nida? Here, slightly different. So that's what the Gemara presents as this machlokas. This is a lengthy brisa as well. The brisa says, Amar Reb Tarfon, mikvah zeh b'chezkas shalim hu omed. We had a chazaka up until now. Why would you assume that it was always like this? We had a standing chazaka. And because you don't know when the amount of water got less than 40. So you're going to assume everything, therefore, is besafek. Reb Tarfon doesn't want to hear it. Al tachzeren misafek. Don't make everything bad because of a possible safek. The chazaka was there. The chazaka was standing that it was 40 sa. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Adam zeh b'chezkaz tami hu omed. You're right that the pool, the mikvah, has a chazaka of tara, but the man going into the mikvah has a chazaka of tuma. If you're going to say to stick with your original chazakos, what do you want me to do? Misafek atabal taro, al titarenu misafek. You can't say that you're going to remove your chazaka, his chazaka of tuma. Man goes into the mikvah tameh. You can't remove his chazaka because you have an assumption. Your assumptions might be wrong. And therefore, the man's starting chazaka, his pre-existing chazaka is that he was tameh, so therefore he remains tameh. Amar Reb Tarfon, let's talk this out. Rabbi Tarfon says, we're 10, 12 lines down. Let's compare this to a case of a Kohen who's in the middle of his avoda, and they're bringing korbanos on the mizbeach. Ben gerusha o ben chalutza. Then they tell him, after days of work and doing dozens of korbanos, by the way, I forgot to tell you, you're really puzzled for avoda because you're a ben gerusha ben chalutza. So halacha l'maisa doesn't matter. Everything that he did before in Shavuot kshera. We don't assume that all of his previous work was problematic. Rabbi Akiva, look, Rabbi Tarfon, I hear what you're saying, but your mashal is not a good mashal, because really the more appropriate mashal is like this. Yes, the Kohen is standing there on top of the mizbeach. He just finished a dozen korbanos for the day. Dashu balmum. And now we find out that he's a balmum. Maybe somebody saw him changing as he was a Kohen, and he put on some of his Kohen vestments, and then he goes out and he does a couple of korbanos, and someone says, by the way, I saw the Kohen changing. He's a mum. He's a balmum. It says the Gemara that if a Kohen was a balmum, so that's more permanent in nature, then Shavodah Psula. So Rabbi Akiva says that din is more accurate, is more aligned with our case than the case of the Kohen who became a Ben Gerusha, Ben Chalutza. So let's review. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon wanted to compare our case to different things. Remember, our case is the mikvah that used to have 40 sa, and now it has 39.5. So what happens with all of the korbanos that were done up until we determined the amount of liquid? Rabbi Tarfon was of the opinion, that it's all considered fine. All the previous korbanos are fine, and he compares it to a case where a kohen is now known to be a ben gerusha or ben chalutza, where avodaso kshera in the past. We're not worried about what happened in the past. Everything is kosher. Masha Enkin, Rabbi Akiva compared the case of the mikvah that's chaser and assessing all of the previous korbanos where he says that they're all tameh, not to a case where a kohen was determined to be a ben gerusha or a ben chalutza, but rather to a case where it's determined that the kohen is a balmum. Amar Rabbi Tarfon says, we're a third of the way down, heading toward the Mishnah. Ata dimisu lebalmum, va'ani dimisiv leben gerusha or leben chalutza. He said, you wanted to compare our case to a case of a balmum, where there's an inherent flaw in the kohen. Shavodasa psula, and that's never going to be okay. All of his past avoda, all of his past korbanos are going to be puzzle. But I wanted to compare them to something else. So nira lemidome, let's analyze and see which of these two examples, the kohen who is determined to be a ben gerusha or ben chalutza, or the kohen who is now determined to be a balmum, which one of those is more similar to our case, where the mikvah is now nimdad v'nimsa chaser, and we have to question all of the previous korbanot, previous tvilos that were done in that mikvah. Idom ben gerusha ben chalutza, if the comparison between the case of the mikvah and our case of a kohen is to the case where he becomes a ben gerusha ben chalutza, so then nidonenu ben gerusha ben chalutza, then we should treat that mikvah case like we did the other case, which is avodaso kshera. And if we want to say doma lebalmum, and if you want to say that the mikvah case is like Rabbi Akiva and compared to a kohen who was then determined to be a balmum, nidonenu kebalmum, then we should assess that person to be a balmum, and therefore avodaso psula, because if in fact we found a balmum that way, and we're going to learn the Mari Makomos for these two things soon, then we would assume avodaso psula, same should be true by the mikvah, that the mikvah, according to Rabbi Akiva, is compared to a case of a kohen who is now found to be a balmum, and therefore everything's puzzle. Tehischil Rabbi Akiva ladun. Rabbi Akiva turned on the Yiddish cup, and he started thinking. And he won over Rabbi Tarfon in one comment. Mikvah, psula b'yachid, ubalmum, psula b'yachid. A mikvah can become puzzle with one person, and a balmum can become puzzle with one person. Ve'al yochiach ben gerusha ben chalutza shepsula b'shnai. But you're not allowed to bring any comparison from the case of the mikvah to the case of ben gerusha ben chalutza, because the case of ben gerusha ben chalutza requires two people to puzzle, and the case of the mikvah only requires one. Davar acher, another approach. Mikvah psula begufo. Balmum psula begufo. If you have a mikvah that's broken in a way that it's pasul begufo, or if a person has a mum where he's pasul begufo, the al yochiach ben grusha ben chalutza shepsula me'acherim. You can't compare that to a case of a ben grusha or ben chalutza where he's not the one who did anything wrong. Somebody else did something wrong. His mother did something wrong. So therefore, you can't compare the two. After hearing these two svaras, Rabbi Tarfon was kafuf, and he said, Omar le Rabbi Tarfon akiva kol aporish mincha keporish minachayim. Anybody who leaves you, they're off of life support. That's as if they've left life and they're no longer alive. Your svaras are perfect. There's nothing wrong with them. He gave two beautiful svaras as to why it has to be that our case, the case of the mikvah that was nimdad v'nimtza chaser, and how we assess the previous Tzivilos in that mikvah, it is not comparable to the world of Ben Grusha Ben Chalutza for two reasons. Number one is that Ben Grusha Ben Chalutza requires two Eidim. And number two is Ben Grusha Ben Chalutza is not that guy's fault, it's his parents' fault. Masha Ein Kain, the other case of a Balmum, which is Begufo, that makes much more sense to compare that. And that also only requires one person to make a mikvah pasal, so it's more comparable to the case of Balmum, and therefore, halacha lemaisa, we would view this case as a case where if the mikvah was nimdad v'nimtza chaser, that all of the previous tfilos would be problematic. All right, says the Gemara halfway down. Hi balmum shepsula b'yachid hechidami. What's the case of a balmum? We discussed this earlier in the Brisa, and now we're just analyzing. What is the case of a balmum who is psula b'yachid hechidami, where a balmum can become a balmum with only one witness? Either kamak chishle mimehemen. If he's going to combat it, so then I'm allowed to argue that. If you say I'm a balmum and I say no, I'm not, I'm allowed to argue against you. Ella, it must be the shasik. If you say that I'm a balmum and then I'm silent, so then shtika kihoda adamya, and then maybe perhaps I'm a balmum. Maybe the same thing is true, that if a man goes over to a Kohen and says while he's doing the avoda, by the way, you're a ben Gerusha or you're a ben Chalutza, he must have been silent in that case too. And the Katani, we have a brisa, mikvah psula b'yachid, u'balmum psula b'yachid, that a mikvah can become puzzle with one person, and a balmum can become puzzle with one person. Ba'al yochiach ben Gerusha ben Chalutza, shep psula b'shnayim. So what do we see over here? We see that when it comes to something from the world of Arayos, that it's psula b'shnayim, not one. And the difference that Rabbi Akiva gave, the reason why Rabbi Akiva compared the case of mikvah to the case of balmum and not to the case of Ben Grusha Ben Chalutza is because Ben Grusha Ben Chalutza is in the category of Dvarim Sheva Erva. The aim Davar Sheva Erva Pachos Mishnayim. So this is a raya for the sheet of Rava. What would Abaye do to answer this? We're 2/3 of the way down. The Abaye Omar Le'olam de Kamak Chishlei. No, it's not correct. There really were people who were conflicting. He didn't respond silently. He said something. So why then would he be believed? The Amar le shlachach vay. If a guy says that he's not a balmum, you got to tell him, take off your shirt. Let's see that you're not a balmum. Okay, let's make sure. You can prove it. Your body's right here. Let's figure it out. The Hainu Dekatani, we have a brisa like this as well. Mikvah psula begufa, balmum psula begufa, bal yochech ben grush ben chalutza, shepsula me'achem. So Abai is able to wriggle out of his concerns with Rava's presentation, and therefore it's possible to understand the brisa that we just learned a little bit differently. Now let's analyze some of the facts that we learned inside this brisa. Not really connected to our sugya directly anymore. We've answered our questions about the shitas of Rava and Abaye, but the Gemara does want to round out this sugya to make sure we're knowledgeable about about some of the sources. How do we know? How do we know that if a Kohen is found to have been a ben Gerusha or ben Chalutza while he's on his mishmar, and somebody calls him out and says, by the way, your mother was divorced and she married a Kohen and you're the product, how do we know that all of his previous avodas are considered kosher? So to this, the Gemara says, Amar Yehuda Mar Shmuel Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "Vayisalo zera acharav, bein zera kasher, bein zera pasal." Doesn't matter, even if you're going to be zera pasal, even if you're going to be a halal, the ma'aseh, the korbanos are still acceptable. But Shmuel Amar, he gave a different source. Mehacha, Baruch Hashem chilof al yadav tirtzeh, afilu chulin shabot tirtzeh. Even if you have someone who's a chulin, someone who's a halal, someone who's not the ideal kohen, the ma'aseh, their korbanos are still acceptable. But Yana Amar Mehacha, he brings a different pasuk. Uvasal hakohen asher b'yamim lohem. Says the Gemara, what do you mean to bring a Kohen in those days? We want to bring him to a Kohen who's not in those days. What's with this odd language? Why does the pasuk say Asher Yabayim Imahim? We must be talking about a Kohen who's a different kind of a Kohen. It's a Kohen who was nischalal, he became a chala. So that's how we know that if a ben Gerusha ben Chalutza finds out that if a regular Kohen finds out he's a ben Gerusha ben Chalutza while he's doing his avoda, we know that it's all still going to be kosher. All of his previous korbanos are kosher because of one of the various psukim that we just read. What about the other presumption that we saw inside this lengthy brisa here on Samach Vav Amud Beis? We are right now at the end of the first middle width line. Balmum de avodaso psulim min olam. How do we know that if it's determined that a Kohen in the middle of his avoda has a mum, that everything he's done in the past is also problematic? Amar Yehuda Amar Shmuel, the Amar Kra. L'chein emor hineni nosein lo es berisi shalom. Kshehu shalim v'lo kshu chaser. You have to be shalim. You can't be missing any body parts of significance, otherwise you're going to be puzzled. Shalom ksiv. How can you say that it's being the drasha of shalom? The pasuk says it's brisi shalom. That says the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachman, Vav de Shalom Ketiyahi. The Vav of the word Shalom is broken. And what that means, as much as it does look like a Vav, but because of the fact that the Vav is broken, we're able to make a drasha that doesn't sound like Shalom, but rather Shalem. And therefore, we're still able to make our drasha. And a Kohen who finds out that he's a Balmum in the middle of his avoda is not going to be considered kosher, certainly for the future, and even retroactively would not be considered kosher for anything he's done in the past. We'll stop right here. In Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll pick up tomorrow with a recording starting at the new mission on Samach Vav Amud Beis. Wishing you all a beautiful day.